We tend to think of trauma as this deeply personal thing, right? Something that happens to one person. But what if it's bigger than that? What if a wound could echo, not just through one family, but across an entire community for generations? That's the powerful and really complex idea we're going to dig into. So that brings us to the big question. Can trauma actually be inherited? I'm talking about the pain from things like war, oppression, or a huge disaster. Can that really be passed down to people who never even lived through it? Well, a growing body of research is starting to suggest the answer is a complicated but pretty resounding yes.
And to really get this, it is so crucial to understand the difference here. We're not just talking about the trauma one person goes through, we're exploring what's called historical trauma. Think of it as a collective wound, one that affects entire groups of people who share an identity, with ripples that just keep spreading long after the original event is over.
Okay, so let's dive in and really try to grasp what historical trauma means. We need to get past a vague feeling and look at the actual framework that explains how the past is still very much alive in the present. Let's break down the academic definition.
All right, there is a lot packed into that sentence, but a few words really jump out. First, collective, so right away we know it's not about just one person. Then, inflicted on a group, that ties it directly to a shared identity. And finally, spans generations. And honestly, that's the part that's kind of mind-bending when you really stop to think about it.
You can really boil it down to three core pieces. First, it all kicks off with some kind of huge shared traumatic event. We're talking things on the scale of genocide, slavery, or forced relocation. Second, that trauma wasn't random. It was specifically targeted at a particular group. And third, and this is the absolute key, the shockwaves, the psychological and social fallout, are still being felt by their descendants generations later. And this idea, it didn't just pop out of nowhere. It has a pretty fascinating history. It first started to surface back in the 1960s when researchers were studying the children of Holocaust survivors. Then, in the mid-90s, we had this pivotal moment when a researcher named Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart applied this framework to the experiences of Indigenous Americans. Now, today, it's a critical lens for understanding the legacy of trauma in communities all over the world.
Okay, but how? How does an event that happened so long ago still hold so much power over people today? Well, here's the twist. It's not just about what happened back then. The real power of historical trauma is in the stories we tell about it today. And this quote from medical anthropologist Alan Young just hits the nail on the head. He argues that trauma isn't just the event itself, it's the representation of that event. It's how we remember it, how we frame it, the whole story we build around it now. That story, that's where the power comes from. So let's walk through how that narrative gets built. It all has to start with something real, right? So step one is always the actual historic events, the injustice, the disaster, the oppression. That's the bedrock. But those facts don't just sit in a history book. They get woven into public narratives. These are the stories passed from grandparents to grandchildren, the shared memories that create a collective understanding of what happened to us. And then these historical narratives get triggered by things happening right now, what researchers call contemporary reminders. It could be a stereotype in a movie, a microaggression at work, even just a news story that feels a little too familiar. These things can act like a switch, reactivating the pain of that original trauma. And the result of all this? Real, tangible impacts on people's health and on society. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because it's a true double-edged sword. On one side, these narratives can be a source of ongoing distress and health problems. But on the other side, they can be a source of incredible resilience and group identity. It's a really complex picture. Okay, so we've got this powerful academic framework. It makes sense. But we need to make a sharp pivot here. Because in recent years, a strong critique has emerged arguing that the language of trauma is being co-opted and, well, used in a very different way. Professor Lily Shuliaraki at the London School of Economics looks at this through the example of Donald Trump. Her argument is that powerful figures can actually adopt the language of the victim, framing themselves as the ones being persecuted, all to consolidate power and deflect criticism. The core of her argument is this: claiming you're a victim isn't always a plea for empathy. It can be a strategic move to gain power. When the powerful do this, their voices get amplified, and that can end up harming historically marginalized groups. The language of pain becomes a weapon in a political struggle. And this critique isn't just about politics.
A similar dynamic is now being observed in our workplaces, on social media, in our professional lives, creating what some have started to call a victimhood economy.
This statistic really grounds the idea in the real world. Almost 40% of managers admit to avoiding honest feedback with minority employees because they're afraid of being accused of bias. It points to this chilling effect, where the fear of being labeled an oppressor actually gets in the way of basic management. So this table really contrasts two very different ways of thinking about advocacy. The critique here suggests that while historic movements were all about collective progress and resilience, this newer victimhood economy can sometimes pivot toward personal leverage, using outrage as a way to sidestep accountability.
So what does this actually look like in practice? Well, critics point to things like using the language of DEI, that's diversity, equity, and inclusion, to deflect perfectly valid performance feedback, or curating stories of struggle on social media just for attention, or even treating any kind of personal discomfort as if it's systemic oppression just to avoid a challenge.
So, where does all this leave us? We've explored two powerful and pretty opposing ideas: the deep generational wounds of historical trauma and the critique of how the language of victimhood can be weaponized. The challenge isn't choosing one over the other, but navigating the really difficult space where both can be true. Here's the first side of this tension. We have to recognize the very real suffering passed down through generations. To deny that is to deny history itself. And at the same exact time, here's the other side. We also have to critically analyze how the powerful can co-opt the language of that suffering for their own gain, potentially drowning out the voices of the truly vulnerable. The real challenge here, for all of us, is discernment. It requires a kind of nuance that's often missing from our public conversations. We're all being challenged to tell the difference between authentic calls for justice and strategic plays for power, between real resilience and calculated resentment. And that's the question I really want to leave you with. In a world where stories of pain can be both a path to healing and a tool for power, how do we navigate that line? How do we know when a story is a wound and when it's a weapon?